Okay, there's a few more people joining, but given that it's just after 3, I think we'll make a start with some introductions. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for this workshop. It's the first of a series, I believe. We're going to be talking about the GIN chapter that we've updated, looking at recruiting, supporting and overcoming barriers to involving patients and the public in guideline development work. It's not a very short title. We have a number of presenters with us today, so if I can just start with some introductions. I'm Sarah Scott. I'm a public involvement advisor based at NICE in England, and my job really is to do pretty much what the title is of this workshop. I'm a health psychologist by trade, and I try to bring in some bits and bobs to inform what I do here. If I can just pass you over to my colleague Lindsay. Lindsay, could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Sarah. As mentioned, my name is Lindsay Howitt, and I'm an acting senior manager in guideline development and research at the Registered Nurses Association for Ontario in Canada. And a signature program at RNAO is the Best Practice Guidelines program, which really focuses on developing and supporting the uptake and evaluating the use of best practice guidelines. We launched this program in 1999, and since 2005, we've been working to involve and support people with lived experience, including patient representatives in guideline development. So just such a pleasure to be here with you today. And I really look forward to this discussion that we have. And I'll pass it over to you, Hiba.
Thank you. So this is Hiba. I am based in Chicago, United States. I am clinical content coordinator at Guideline Center, which is private company developed many deliveries. One of them is to develop, and this is my job, to develop summaries in plain language summaries out of the guidelines to be distributed and disseminated to the patients. And I also a former research associate at the American Dental Association and a member of many GIN groups, including GIN Public.
Thank you for that. So just before we start, just a few things about how the meeting, the workshop will run. This is a standard Zoom meeting setup, so please do keep yourself on mute. You can use the chat function, so please do write questions, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we can take your questions then. We also have a Padlet, which is a digital whiteboard, which resembles sticky notes as well. And we've set that up and we circulated that link. And you can, as we're going through, you can use that and write down your barriers and solutions as we're going through. Just to also let you know that this meeting is being recorded and will be edited and put onto published on the GIN website. So let's get started. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what the workshop aims to do, so we will provide an overview of the updated GIN chapter. Just to give you a little bit of background to that, this actually involved 2 chapters from the original toolkit that we updated with relevant evidence and literature about barriers and how to overcome them. And we actually merged these 2 chapters together. So we'll be giving you an overview of what we say in that, and it'll probably take about half an hour before opening it out into discussion. And throughout, we'll explore examples of best practice from NICE, RNAO and other centres, and we'll also have a chance for everyone to explore and discuss the common barriers and solutions for how to recruit and support people. And of course, we would love to be able to establish whether there's any gaps of information in the chapter. The chapter is digital, so we're able to update it as new information becomes available. So we do hope to take something away from this workshop and hopefully update that chapter too. So I'll get started then with a bit of an overview of how this chapter starts, and the sorts of things that we sort of encourage people to start thinking about when trying to initially think about who they're going to recruit and involve in their guideline development work. So the first thing we say is for developers to consider the roles and tasks of the patient and public members. One of the things that consistently came up in the literature was a whole host of problems and barriers that people experienced. So whoever's just joined, can you please put yourself on mute? Thank you. So yeah, there was a whole host of barriers associated with what happens when you haven't considered the appropriate roles and tasks for patient and public members. And the sorts of things to consider is obviously what skills and knowledge are people going to need for different tasks associated with different stages of the guideline development life cycle. One of the noted barriers that kept coming up was around people not being happy with the focus of the guideline. So often was the case that one of the solutions to that was involving people in the scope, so that they are better able to get across the issues and key issues and things that were important to patients and the public. And this apparently improved engagement throughout the guideline development cycle. We also suggest information around considering the skills and experience that people are going to need, which map onto those roles and tasks. So it's a little bit obviously like recruiting for a job, really, in that we can use things like role descriptions and person specifications, which some centres do, such as NICE, but we don't necessarily use CVs. And we provide a sort of suggestion for developers to consider essential skills, so things that are absolutely needed, such as or experience, so experience of the topic, and to consider what can be learnt on the job or via training. One of the things that was consistently coming up as a barrier in the literature was the fear that people might not know how to do research, or they might not understand it. So a solution to that is obviously to provide that training around research methods. Lindsay, do you have anything to add to this?
Thanks, Sarah. I'll just touch on that last point that you had as well about not necessarily needing to require a CV from people. This is something that we do at RNAO as well. When we invite people to apply online to be considered for an expert panel, we let them know what we're looking for, just generally in terms of significant experience with the guideline topic, comfort speaking about their experience, the ability to work in a collaborative setting with others. But in terms of a CV, we don't ask for that. We do ask sometimes to provide a brief bio, describe their experience relevant to the topic and their areas of interest, and why they want to participate on the panel. And if they've any other previous experience in the past, providing input as someone who has lived experience, say for a healthcare organization as well. So there's definitely some alignment there with what we do at RNAO too.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, the other things to consider in the beginning, we recommend, and the evidence and literature suggests that developers need to consider the type of patient and public member, such as a patient carer or a member of a patient organisation, and the number of people that may be needed to kind of represent the topic. At NICE, we suggest more than at least 2 people should be recruited, patient and public members, to join a committee or a guideline panel. Although that can be more if the topic covers a complex condition, then that some of the barriers that this helps to overcome is reducing things like isolation and increases support. The other thing that we also talk about quite a bit is the issue of representation. So obviously, one person or even two people can't necessarily represent absolutely everybody. And one of the barriers is finding enough people to represent the complexities of the condition. So we provide some kind of, in the chapter, some solutions to those types of things. So, for example, one of the ideas, if people, on the one hand, we're talking about recruiting multiple people, but I know that some people struggle to recruit even one. So we talk about approaching how you can approach that differently, how you can think outside the box. By approaching different types of organisations that may be associated with that particular condition. Lindsay, do you have anything to add to this?
I'll just jump in and just say too that at RNAO we do aim to have at least 20% of the people who are on our panels to have a lived experience, and if the guideline topic is really strongly focusing on health equity, we would want that to be a much larger number as well, looking at more like an aim to have about 80% of the people on the panel having lived experience with the topic as well. So those are some of the goals that we set. Thanks, Sarah.
Brilliant, thank you. So then with that in mind, then obviously, we're talking about recruiting multiple people. We're talking about recruiting quite a lot, and I think some people may be thinking, well, we're struggling to get any engagement and we're struggling to recruit even one person. So how can we get that representation? So we cover a couple of sort of types of recruitment strategies within the chapter. And I'll just briefly cover them now. One of them is open recruitment, which is similar to recruiting for a job advert and interview. And we compare and contrast that to nomination, which is where we call it shoulder tapping, or it's where you may approach a clinician who may know a patient, and then they can come onto the panel. There are advantages and disadvantages of both of these. So, for example, with open recruitment, one of the advantages suggested advantages is that it's potentially transparent, and you are able to potentially open it up to a broader pool of people with a broad range of experience, where nomination may be focused, but at the same time, open recruitment can be really time consuming, and it can be really costly, and can require lots of resource in advertising, interviewing, preparing documents, things like that, where nomination is quick. And that's useful if you don't have enough time to go through open recruitment. So depending on what you're doing and the time frame and the resources that you have, you may need to consider the different types of recruitment strategies. There are as I said, there are limitations. Nomination has been accused of being biased potentially. It can introduce all kinds of problems. If you have a clinician on a guideline and they've introduced one of their patients, then there's issues around, will that patient be able to openly talk about their experiences in front of the clinician? Will it cause any kind of conflict of interest? There's all these different issues that need to be considered. And we talk about how to overcome some of those limitations in the chapter, one of which we use an example from Sign in Scotland, who use nomination through umbrella organisations, and it's kind of a bit more objective. The umbrella organisations will recruit on their behalf, and that way they're able to get a broad pool of potential participants. So overall, we have to sort of think about the type of recruitment strategy that we're going to use depending on our circumstances. Heba, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, thank you. So it's a hard question, and for everyone, it has advantage and disadvantage, as Sarah mentioned. So, for example, for open enrollment, or open recruitment, one of the advantage is you can have a space for the panel and other staff member to have or contribute in the shared decision making. Other thing, and there is a phrase I always say, you never expect what you're gonna hear from the patients. So the more you interview patients, the more you're gonna find you can hear something, and you have patients ads and patient values which you never thought about it. Maybe you have patient experience and patient criteria you never thought about it. So it's very rewarding experience, but again, it's time consuming. And one thing I learned from interviewing patients and that I need to give the exact time and even emotions when interviewing patients. So if I'm in a bad mood, I should like reschedule, for example, because I need to be, it's like you interview someone for a job. You need to be extremely fair and candid. Other thing, if you are working in an guideline developing organization, if you're gonna do open recruitment, are you gonna do this advertisement on your website, social media, or are you gonna ask other organization to do it for you? Because if you're gonna do it yourself, please think about having a social media which approach to the patients, because if your social media just approach physicians, it's gonna be hard to reach to the real patient. So this is other thing you need to think about. It's hard question, so whatever you choose, it's it's variable.
Exactly, thank you. I suppose that leads me on to this next. I think you've covered quite a few of these things. There's additional considerations, obviously, such as about social media and how you're going to recruit, and if social media is even the right way to go. There may be costs, for example, associated with recruitment and adverts and things like that. And the time it takes to prepare the recruitment, although the way NICE gets around that is we use templates, so that just speeds things up. But the special considerations that you'll have to consider if you're going to interview people, and of course considerations around how to confirm the appointment, you know, what to do with the people who are unsuccessful. And I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the expert panel and how we managed to keep hold of all the people who are unsuccessful but really good, got lots of good experience, and how we can offer opportunities to them. But Hebrew, did you have anything else to add to this? No, I think we said everything. Brilliant. Lindsay, did you have anything to add?
Not at this time. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks.
I may add something, I'm sorry, about documentation that so documentation for the recruitment, and also later on you're gonna need more documents like conflict of interest and maybe tax paper. So it's something you need to consider. Whatever way of recruitment, you need some documentation to consider.
Absolutely. So yeah, so in terms of just a suggestion that I just introduced about this, an idea of an expert panel and what to do with, well, not just what to do with when you recruit people. If you do get a number of applicants and you can't recruit them all, if you're fortunate to do that in the first place, then we've come up with an expert panel at NICE, and this has a number of functions. We currently have managed to recruit over 250 people. And this was to help us with all kinds of barriers that we were experiencing. You know, NICE largely recruits through patient organisations and charities. And there are quite a few charities in the UK, but they probably receive many requests from NICE alone, plus other organisations to help them with different things. So that introduces a burden in the system, and it means that sometimes we can't engage stakeholders, and actually we can't recruit all the time, particularly you know, rare diseases and things like that. So we thought, well, if we can create our own panel, then we can tap into that resource to recruit and bring people onto different committees as we are developing them. So this covers, we've got all kinds of people with all kinds of health conditions and experiences and mental health conditions, experiences of these things. We have carers and patients and members of the public. There is a bulletin that is sent out every month which promotes opportunities across the whole organisation. And this isn't just about getting involved in the guideline development work. It can also be anything around surveys, evaluations, things like that. But what's really good is it gives us the opportunity to do focused recruitment drives. So if we are struggling to recruit a particular group, or if we notice that there's a particular condition or cultural group that is underrepresented, then we can in advance start potentially reaching out to different groups and people to allow us a bit more time to recruit and invite people onto the panel. And so far we've managed to fill around 37 committee vacancies, so it is proving quite a success at the moment. So I just want to move on to the next section of the presentation, which is about the support that we can offer. Once we have recruited people, what kind of support do we need to bring the best out of them and to make sure that they can contribute well and have a generally positive experience of guideline development work. And I'll just kind of briefly go over the main points that we raise in the chapter. There's quite a lot of detail, but the main point, first of all, is that we try to emphasize the need for a needs assessment. So when you've recruited someone, to assess what kind of practical support, financial support, informal support or training do they need to be able to participate well in the programme of work. And to also review this needs assessment over time, because obviously when we're recruiting people with different health conditions or mental health conditions, there may be symptom flare-ups, there may be changes and fluctuations or deteriorations in symptoms. So sometimes that means that we have to assess those needs over time in case they change. So the sorts of things, we cluster the different types of support into things like practical support, financial, informal. So, for example, if we are trying to include people who have different physical or cognitive disabilities, we may need to look into the sorts of reasonable adjustments to meetings or papers that we're going to have to consider. And the chapter goes into a lot of kind of detail around what some of those examples are. Financial support, one of the common barriers is people find it difficult taking part because they can't get time off, or they may need childcare, or they're a carer for someone and they can't. So whether your organisation may be able to provide that financial support, but I'm aware that obviously some organisations struggle with that. So it's a case of being honest and open about whether the position does have expenses or honoraria provided, or whether it is a voluntary position, so that people can choose whether to take part. And of course, informal support. So that's more about, how to encourage people to contribute and share experiences during meetings. We mentioned about having named contacts, so a key person to go to. And this can be for anything, including how to deal with the meeting papers, how to, deal with the emotional aspect of being part of this type of work. I'm just wondering, Lindsay, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
Thanks, Sarah. I can just speak a little bit to one of the last points there about sort of icebreaker activities. And this is something we've been trying to do with our panels when we're convening them to work on a guideline, especially when it's right at the beginning of a guideline development process, is really to find opportunities for people who are part of the group to connect in ways maybe outside of just talking about their professional background. So sometimes we try to find activities where people talk about, what's your favorite vacation, favorite food, those sorts of things, try to find commonality amongst people to really try to create an environment where people feel connected and that they can share their voices. And we also try to make our co-chairs for the panel mindful of this too, so that they can be conscious of this and sort of the dynamics on the panel as well. I do just want to point out as well some really great comments that are in the chat box that are coming in too, and we can make sure to talk about these things also later on in the presentation, but just some excellent points in here. There's some points that were mentioned about just being really clear with people as well, even before starting to recruit, about what is expected in terms of, co-authorship or compensation, those sorts of things. Thanks, Janice, for those comments. Some great ways as well about trying to meet people's needs by both caption transcripts and Google Translate, and using different sort of technologies to ensure accessibility. Just going through here, and there was I won't go through them all, but a couple up here as well about later on too, about when we are inviting people to maybe comment on the draft of the guideline as well. If we want to make sure that we are receiving feedback from people who have lived experience, patients, caregivers, et cetera, we really need to think about how we are getting that draft out to people so they have the opportunity to be able to comment on it as well. Lots of other great comments in here too, so we can return to these after, but just wanted to make sure we address those too. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you for that, because I can't see the chat from where I am, so thank you for picking that up. Yeah, those are really great, and yeah, there's all kinds of things. I think there's more. People have got more experience than even what we could write about in this chapter, so that's fantastic. And there's more kind of what we talk about as well. So we talk about the different. One of the additions to this update is emphasising the role of training, co-learning, and feedback. So there's a lot in the literature around this actually about, and this kind of helps overcome some of the barriers that were reported in the literature about developers being concerned about how to ensure that people have the right skills and knowledge, particularly around research, and there's emphasizing the difference between training, which is obviously maybe more formal, it could be informal, workshops or kind of training documents, information, or seminars. And then there's co-learning. So, the idea that everybody on the panel, all the professional members, are going to need to know, what is grade and the guideline development processes. So thinking about introducing presentations during meetings, so that everybody is learning together and on the job, and then providing feedback, kind of after meetings, if we have the resource to do so, then saying, how people have done, have they, how could they improve? And that helps people learn as they go throughout the development process. And then, of course, we talk a little bit about group dynamics. So what happens if there are power imbalances that crop up in meetings? How do we deal with that? So it might be things like approaching the chair and talking to them about it, or providing training to the chair about how to manage group dynamics. It may be things like seating arrangements if you're still doing face-to-face meetings, and relationship building opportunities, things like that. Lindsay, I'm going to hand this over to you to provide an example about how you've supported people around the grade.
Thanks, Sarah. This is something we've just been recently beginning to think about a little bit more at our organization. And at my organization, the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, we use grade for developing guidelines. And a few years ago, we did a project where we sort of interviewed some people who had been involved in our past guidelines to hear about their experiences, ways they felt supported, ways we could improve support for people. And one of the things that we heard from a number of people was that terminology with grade can be challenging for people to understand at times. It can be quite complex, and it can create some barriers for engaging in the development of the guideline. So when we do meet with our panels, we do provide background information about grade and some of those specific terms that are used in grade, and try to orient people to the process. But one of the things we've been recently trying to do has been to create a glossary of terms. So I think we can go to the next slide here. Thanks so much, Sarah. To try to create a glossary of terms that we can share with the panel that uses plain language to try to explain some of these concepts in a simple format. I think this is beneficial for everyone as well across the panel. And so this is something we're trialing. It's a work in progress, and we're going to be collecting feedback on this as we meet with our panels and try this out. But yeah, we're really looking for ways of how we can communicate these kind of complex topics in a way that is more simple and uses plain language.
Thank you, that's great. I think there's probably quite a few of us that could benefit from something like that as well. It would be interesting to see what the feedback says. Okay, so moving on to the next section, we cover some information around how to overcome barriers to people who may struggle to be involved, who are seldom heard for various reasons. And within the chapter, I focus on three groups of people, so people with learning disabilities, people with complex mental health conditions, and also how to involve children and young people. Now, just as a bit of a point, some of the co-authors did ask me why when I was writing this, why we were focusing on just these three kind of sorts of groups of people, and the response to that was that there, in terms of the literature, in terms of what information was out there, really there's only information about these three populations. So we are absolutely open to anybody else who has any information or suggestions about how to involve other types of people who are seldom heard in guideline development. I think that would be great. But there's some general approaches to consider. So things like considering if we can't involve the person with the experience directly of that condition or living with that condition, then to involve carers or advocates or patients, representatives from patient organisations or charities, or in terms of children, young people, potentially involving parents. And then there's a whole other type of cluster, other strategies, it's reference groups or focus groups in order to ensure that we're including a voice and getting information that maybe, if there's gaps in the literature, making sure that we're getting that information into the process. And it may also be things like using different consultation, using things like focus groups or surveys, and also involving patient and public testimony as well. And the chapter goes into that in quite a bit of detail. And one of the things I sort of wanted to summarize is that regardless of the different sorts of challenges and things that people face in terms of, and the barriers that people face in terms of getting involved, there are some key things that we have to consider. So the first thing is obviously depending on the sort of population we're trying to engage, we may need to consider things to do with mental capacity and ability to make decisions and what your local legislations and policies say around this. So, for example, in terms of whether or not you can, the age at which you are able to engage children or young people. So with NICE, we say that we're okay to include people who are 16 years or older. Particularly with parental permission. And there may be specific adjustments that need to be made, and these are going to be completely individual. People have individual needs, but they cluster in terms of the literature. They seem to cluster into different considerations around communication, environmental, financial considerations, and then if we're doing face-to-face meetings, then transportation. How do we get there? These obviously apply to everyone, but in terms of the literature that we looked at, there were specific considerations which the chapter goes into. And again, there's just some points there around making sure that we conduct needs assessments and reviewing those as to capture any new needs that may crop up during development of the guideline. Sometimes people don't necessarily know what they need because they don't know what it involves. So, and this has been found to actually prevent people dropping out of the development process. So I'm going to hand over to Heba to talk about a case study around the challenges and the solutions that she's found for patient involvement.
Thanks, Sarah. And this was a real case study from the American Dental Association. Me and my team, actually, they did a good job. So one of the challenges, or the first challenge, is how to communicate the rationale for including a patient representative to the oversight committee and to the panel members. And it's very challenging because it's very common question, which people may say, okay, we understand you need to involve a patient, but let us know what you expect from the patient, what added value will the patient will give us if we are already seeing patient in the clinic for 20 years or 30 years. And this is very valid. So you have to have rationale and solid rationale. So my take in this, like, don't say, oh, I want to include a patient just because the great says this or nice says this. So one of the rationale, if you searched the literature and you didn't find any evidence about the patient values and preferences towards certain treatment, for example, you cannot provide feedback in the evidence to decision table about patient values and preferences if you cannot find this, if you cannot make systematic review about the patient values and preferences in certain topic. Other thing is, and this is my personal opinion based on my experience, you never expect what the patient can add to your panel. The patient is a variable member in the panel. And I always asked the patient candidate in the interview, if you have a 10 minutes to talk to your dentist, frankly, without any fears, without any barriers, what you're gonna tell them? Because you're gonna have this chance in the panel meeting. And I asked them because I wanna someone who has something to add. So they mentioned things and we use this quotation and we communicated this quotation with our panel expert because we wanted short decision. So this is very important. Some patient mentioned that accurate diagnosis is the most important thing for them, even if the diagnostic aid has side effect. Other patient mentioned that they need the patient to take care of certain things they don't take care about it. So it's always very valuable to hear from the patient. Other thing is finding the non-profit or for-profit or a charity which provide a public member. So if you're gonna use organization to do the recruitment for you, how are you gonna find them? And it's very challenging because some organization like have patient list but they don't collaborate with the guideline development organizations. They collaborate more with focus groups or hospitals. So it's also another challenge. Thirdly, knowledge of the paperwork required, as mentioned earlier. So because this was my first time, I didn't know that it's a lot of work to include a patient. Like, you have the tax paper if you're gonna reimburse the patient, for example. You have conflict of interest to be filled and other paperwork. And lastly, setting inclusion and exclusion criteria for the public members. So you need to, with your team, decide, are you gonna recruit patient advocate versus patient representative? And when we say patient advocate, it's closer to nomination idea. Previous participation in guideline type panel, or you need someone who has no previous experience. And also you need to see the availability to attend the meeting. Communication skills, very important, one of the most important when you choose a patient. Past bad experience versus neutral experience with the dental treatment. So you don't need someone with extreme bad experience because it will affect the decision. And here we're talking about, or I talk about patient representative with a voting voice, because other organizations use patient just to have comment, and this is also important. In my opinion, like having a patient in any way is important. So assessment of patient representative candidate for inclusion on our panel. Patient representative suitability was assessed by 3 staff members who asked a targeted question of each candidate in a 15 to 20-minute Zoom meeting. So the Zoom meeting was not very long because we interviewed, again, it's time consuming. So in order to solve this, we send pre-interview questionnaire with very specific questions, like why you need to join the panel, what you're gonna bring, what is your motivation, because for us this is very important. Question covered such aspects. I think I mentioned many of these questions. So take home message. I respect, yeah, thank you, Sarah. I respect that some people need to follow like all the checklist and all the, but we need to balance between the recommending procedure and the available resources. For example, NICE recommend including 2 patients minimum on each guideline panel. But if you have a problem recruiting 1 patient, and if you focus on the quality and not the quantity, if you have problem reimbursing the patient in your organization, you need to find this balance. Assessing patient representative candidates may require a significant learning curve for the staff and carefully thought out process. And I were discussing this with Sarah and Lindsay. It's not one size fits all. It's like we don't have single questionnaire you can distribute to all patients in organization, for example. You cannot have a specific criteria. So it's a learning curve. After interviewing different patient representative candidates, make a table of the strengths and weaknesses of each candidate. Use their quotation. It's very important from the interview, and involve the guideline panel and other oversight committee member in the final selection process. So I understand it's the process of the function of the methodologist to do this, but again, shared decision making will bring thoughts you never think about. So when I involved the panel member about the decision and showed them some quotation, we had very valuable feedback. Reach out to the non-selected organization and patient and inform them about the decision. It's like job interview, so we recommend this. So yeah, well, I think we're gonna discuss more in the question and answer section, but this was my experience.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so hopefully you found that a helpful overview. We moving into sort of questions and discussions, so a chance for everybody to ask questions and maybe speak to each other as well. So I'm just going to hand this over to Lindsay to facilitate.
Thanks, Sarah and Hiba. And thank you all who are on the line today as well. We're so grateful that you are here. We hope that we've really been able to reinforce how valuable and how important it is to be involving patients and members of the public in guideline development, and hope we can have a conversation about, just as a group as well, about any barriers that you've experienced or encountered to recruiting and supporting people in guideline development, as well as solutions that you've encountered as well. I do know that there may be people on the line here today who have personal experience maybe being involved as well as a patient representative or a member of the public in guideline development, and it's super valuable to hear from you as well, from your perspective. So we did just want to open it up for questions. So sort of the format that we were thinking we could take was that feel free to put your questions either in the chat box, or you can raise up your hand. If you look at the bottom of your screen under the reactions tab, there's sort of the raise hand feature that's there. And feel free to ask your question. And then Sarah, myself, and Hiba, we can try to provide some examples maybe of experiences we've had, any solutions we know of, but we also thought we could open it up to the group as well, because there's so much valuable experience here amongst us, and it would be good to hear from others too. So maybe I'll stop with that, and I'll open it up as well. So feel free to type your questions in the chat box. There's lots of great comments that I see here too, that people are giving about additional barriers they've experienced, and some solutions as well. All right, Ella Haskell, I see you have your hand up. Please feel free to go ahead. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry
thanks.
for that. Okay, this is Lisa Haskell. I'm from the ECRI Guidelines Trust. And prior to that, I was project manager for the National Guideline Clearinghouse. So 20 years of looking at patient participation across guidelines. And one of the things that we've found, particularly with developers who are not really that keen about including patients or have never done it, little tentative, is to suggest that they look at the patient literature. Hiba did talk about having systematic review. That's a wonderful way to do that. But also, I always like to point out to developers that when they're putting together a guideline, this is already something they're used to doing. Searching for literature, selecting literature, analyzing literature. So in some ways, this may be the easiest way for them to incorporate some patient perspectives. And I think it's might be a good initial step for some of them to take. And I'll now mute myself again.
Thank you so much. That's so valuable to hear from you. And I agree. I think it's so important to be searching literature as well to see what we can capture about values and preferences. Janice, I see your hand up as well.
Hi, yeah, I appreciate this. As many of you know, I'm a public patient involved, been involved with guidelines. I think my first training was in 2015, evidence-based guidelines affecting practice policy and stakeholders at New York Academy of Medicine, and I attended a later one. And then I'm currently serving on the American College of Physicians Guidelines panel, sitting on the panel. And we are considered public on there and not patient. We are not patient advocates. They do not have patient advocates, but many do appreciate having patient advocates. So I think that's a very valid point that you brought up. So if you don't mind having patient advocates, then you can reach out to organizations. And when you're reaching out to organizations just to onboard people, I just want to say that the one that I was onboarded onto, the ACP, I really appreciate their methodology because they use nominations and open call, right? So they reached out to multiple organizations, PCORI ambassadors, individuals who had some experience somewhere within evidence, like Cochrane or, NICE. I appreciate that they have this huge pool of individuals. And so they, and then some clinicians put forward names of somebody. So we would have a very diverse group of people from like, a small federal qualified health center in Iowa to somebody that works with the veterans in another rural area, somebody, people that live urban, suburban, have different experiences. And at different times, different individuals have come on. When we first developed it, it was all white people, to be honest. And now it's, we do have individuals from different backgrounds, Native Americans, African Americans have come in, and some of them just for a short time sat on the public panel. So 2 people sit on the actual panel itself, and the public panel itself is comprised of perhaps 10 people. I don't even know the exact number. And some of them have been on the whole time. Everybody's involved with healthcare at some way, either, just appreciate, have had experiences, right? So then we come together on a webinar and discuss like what we're discussing and our thoughts, the public panel's thoughts for the greater public panel on what they think about having, for outcomes, for questions and whatever. So that's very, very beneficial, and you can get a lot done that way, but it's really a preference. And I do recommend too, I do understand it's a problem, but if your patient or public person cannot be on there, you lost that voice. And so 2 is a minimum, I think. I mean, it'd be wonderful to have more. And then also I've been invited to be on multiple other guidelines panels, and some of them haven't been upfront about compensation, and that's very important just to be honest about it, And so that's why I came up with that little video I put on Jen, you can see, or that little PowerPoint, because I think the 3 areas of contention that later will show up with patients, and I don't like the term contention, it's just, it can be a tension in the whole panel, is the COI, conflict of interest. Disclosure of interest has to be very clear. I know a number of patients who don't feel they have to declare because they don't see it's an interest when they're taking pharma and industry conferences. So if you don't call that out as something they just have to disclose, it could still be on there, but it will come up later. And this is a big issue. I was going to write a paper with Andrea Trico about it. We might still do it, but it's very, they don't see it as a DOI. I over claim, and I think that's important. The other is co-authorship. Do you give them, do they have voting privileges? Determine that ahead of time. If they do, just identify them as public patient involved or whatever you want to call it. And then also for compensation. Those three things are going to end up being tension on panels if they're not identified early. Thank you. And training is a whole ballgame too. They shouldn't, I appreciate what Heber brought up about evidence, understanding evidence. There's a big disconnect. I'm one of the only people in America that's patients is really involved in evidence. There isn't a lot of us. And so, they haven't been trained in it. And so Cochrane training and others that are listed at GIN are very important for just the basics. Thank you, sorry.
No, thank you, Janice. That's so valuable hearing your perspective and really highlighting, so many key points there about importance of being transparent at the beginning about conflicts of interest, co-authorship, compensation, providing adequate training, and then also just providing your experiences of some of the work you've done and what it looked like being a part of those groups too. So thank you for that. I do see one question in the chat box too, from Lauren, who's asking, does the toolkit include search strategies for patient values and experiences literature? So Sarah, I know you're lead author on the chapter. I'm wondering if you want to answer that question.
Yeah, I don't think our chapter does, but I'm struggling to recall whether the other chapters, there's quite a few chapters, so there may be a chapter that covers that. I would need to double check. So yeah, it's worth having a look and having a browse and seeing if it does.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I'm same here. I can't think off the top of my head right now, but I know chapter 2 does focus on the use of research to include patient and public views and guidelines. So I would maybe check out chapter 2 first as a good starting point. Any other questions? It can also be questions. It could be barriers you've encountered that maybe you want to hear from others about any potential solutions that you've found helpful. Yeah, sir, please feel free to jump in.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm Yasser Amr. I'm a pediatrician and a guideline methodologist at King Saud University Medical City in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So we are Arabic speaking. Although they teach medicine in English, so all medical and healthcare documents are in English, but it's obvious that people are Arabic speaking. So some of them are not English speaking. So the thing is, I have a lot of debates when we talk about recruiting patients that, okay, I received this from our guideline groups that, okay, they don't know English, how come we're gonna involve them and discuss the guideline, and at which stage, which every time ends up that we will simply give them one of the implementation tools, the patient educational leaflet or material, and this is the only thing that the patient will actually see. And the other alternative that we have came up with in some other projects that, okay, so let's recruit a healthcare provider patient, like a physician with diabetes for diabetes guidelines. So he will be able to, look into the full guideline document and all of the background evidence. He will look into everything. And even as a healthcare provider, he will understand everything. So I would like to hear your input on this. For non-English speakers who either do not have a translated full guideline document and get to look into only the patient educational guide or whatever information, is this enough? And on the other hand, if you recruit a healthcare provider and patient at the same time, is there bias here? And even sometimes these people are sort of embarrassed that they will be cited by their name as patients. So I would like to hear your input on this.
Can I step in here? So yeah, as I mentioned, having a patient who is true patient, not patient / healthcare provider, is very experience, which not unlike any other experience. So having a dentist or physician who is patient at the same time, in my opinion, it will bring a lot of bias, a lot of education, which not needed. you need to hear from the patient who has the fears and doesn't have any opportunity to communicate the fears, or he has demands which really has opportunity to communicate this demand. So mentioning this, if we have a problem like language, as you mentioned, I don't know if the panel, so is your panel talking in English, but the patient like should be Arabic speaker? Is this a problem? Sorry, I didn't get this.
No, I meant if you are talking about like regular patients, it might be that it's an Arabic speaker, I mean, non-English speaker, and you know, all of the guideline, most of the guideline out there is English, French, or otherwise.
Oh yeah, you mean, okay, it's, in my
And the
opinion,
only thing, so there's a language barrier.
okay,
The only available thing in Arabic is the patient educational guide, the summary, the very, very plain language summary, not the full guideline document with all of the technical parts. So this
it's a
is my
good point.
question.
It's a good point. But if you think about it, you're gonna face the same thing, even if the patient English speaker, because as I mentioned in the chat box, when I interviewed patients, they don't even, some of them really don't know what panel mean. So you're actually talking about a new language to everyone, even for the English speaker. So here comes training and education. I know there is a language barrier, but here is the training. You're going to provide them the guideline. You're going to provide them a plain language summary of the guideline, which is available in many places. And you're going to tell them exactly what you expect from them. Because again, with English speaker patient, at least in my opinion, we have the same problem. We use jargon in the guidelines. We use terminology. So they're gonna have the same exact training. So if you compare the benefits and harm of including a patient just because there is a language barrier, I would include and train the patient rather than not include. And in my just opinion, in my experience, I would include the patient who is not healthcare provider, because you don't need background knowledge, you don't need bias, you don't need so many things we carry as healthcare providers. At least we read the literature, so this causes a great bias. I'm going to give you a quick example. I personally have a great bias against some things used in dentistry, but based on the literature, not personal bias, but the patient don't care about this. Maybe the patient prefer having accurate diagnosis over anything else. So patient experience is, or patient needs different and not biased. This is in my opinion. I'm not sure if Sarah and Lindsay agree or not.
Maybe I would just jump in and say too that yeah, I agree. Sometimes the term we often use at RNAO is people with lived experience with the topic. So sometimes we recognize that people with lived experience may also have additional areas of expertise too who are on the panel. So maybe they do have experience in clinical expertise or research as well. So we recognize that, I think too. I think it does come down to recognizing that maybe their experience might be slightly different though than people who don't come with clinical expertise as well. And recognizing that. Sarah, is there anything else that you wanted to jump in and talk about for this too?
I suppose yeah, so yeah, I completely agree with what people are saying. Just I know we're talking about the translation and the language barrier, and then we're also talking about the healthcare professional bias. Just to say on that point, at NICE, we often say that if we exclude people if they are a health professional in the direct the area of the topic that's been looked at, and then we have to consider if it's a health professional but not a direct in that area, then we have to consider that as well, because it does introduce a bias, as people have explained. But my understanding is that you're trying to assess, is it enough that people who don't speak English only to see a patient guide or an easy read version, and I personally have encountered this at NICE, and I'm wondering if anybody else, I noticed you opened that up to the floor. Is anybody else experienced this? Does anybody else have any thoughts about whether or solutions on how to overcome this? No.
Yeah, I mean, if the guidelines provided in English, as I mentioned, again, it can be hard even for English speakers if it's very complicated. So Google Translate or WHO Translate, or it's gonna be extra work for sure, but in my opinion, it's worth it because you're gonna communicate the recommendation or evidence in a simple way anyway. So you can just, you're gonna educate the patient about the terminology anyway, either it's English or Arabic.
This is Janice. I agree with that. Also, I've been looking at the GIN checklist because it's in the process of being, whatever, updated. It needs to be updated, but it is in what, 6 different languages or something. I mean, I see a lot of language in the checklist itself, and somebody goes, oh, write feedback. I don't have time. There was a lot that I found that could be improved there. So I don't know. They should have patients involved with the checklist updating. Also, I think something very important, I don't remember who brought it up, but mentors. And it could be, you might call it a buddy system, but in reality, I found so beneficial. I had, I don't know, I don't think this had happened very often, but one of the previous panel members who was a clinician and a professor offered his expertise when we first were onboarded to the whole public panel for questions, right? And so because we all were somewhat knowledgeable about medical issues, either caring for children or family members or ourselves, we had some understanding. We also did have onboarding training onto it, right? So some of the basics of evidence, whatever, but having that individual to write to was so beneficial to ask, so we didn't feel stupid, to be honest, right? And he was a doctor and he was very kind, and that was so helpful. So don't only think of a buddy system, because if you put 2 people together that don't know the system, it might not, you want to put a seasoned person to be available, like I'm always available if people have questions, in this area, and, there's people like Maureen Smith in systematic reviews. There's other people that could really assist. And I think that's very important, as well as who is the program officer or manager, whatever, of the committee itself, right? Whoever the lead person is can also assist.
Janice, thank you so much for that. That's such a great suggestion, I think, of having someone to be paired up with who can provide guidance in that way as well. Great suggestion. Thank you. I see a question in the chat box as well from Diana asking, is managing the conflict of interest in itself a barrier in recruiting a sufficient pool of people from the public? Great question. I have not had experience with this myself, where this has been an issue, but wondered if or Sarah, if you have any thoughts on this, or we can also open it up to others and hear what their experiences.
Yeah, I suppose it could be an issue, but it isn't an issue. It doesn't come up too much, but it can do, so depending on the person. The sorts of people it can affect is if you're trying to recruit someone who works within an organization, like a patient organization, and they've either been funded by pharma or they've been invited to a speaking event that's also been funded by something. So yeah, sometimes that can, but yeah, I think there's also ways of managing it, particularly at NICE. If people have been involved in research, for example, that doesn't exclude people obviously from being recruited. It just means that if the topic happens to use that research, then they may need to either not, leave the meeting for that part, so there's no conflict of interest as it's been discussed, or there's other ways of managing it. But yeah, I think that's all I've got to sort of say on the matter. Does anybody else have anything to add?
Yeah, I can step in. So yeah, it can be just regular paperwork and training for the patient. But sometimes, like when I interviewed, as Sarah mentioned, when I interviewed the organization to recruit the patient, I asked it about, yes, source of funding, and if they are profit organization or non-for-profit. So as any conflict of interest, we have intellectual conflict of interest and financial. So actually I ask it for both and search it for both. So for intellectual conflict of interest, because we have some organization which totally against, for example, the modern medicine, for example, or they are against a certain approach in the intervention. In my opinion, it should be a conflict of interest. Like if they are against any intervention which is medical, how can they use the evidence, or the patient can use the evidence to develop or vote on a recommendation? So generally speaking, yeah, no problem other than the time and paperwork, but sometimes you need to consider, and it's going to be very obvious from the website.
Thank you. Janice, I see your hand up as well.
Yeah, I just want to say that, so I know somebody mentioned to me, because I had a website, I was an advocate. That isn't true. You know, having a website is not being an advocate. I do not identify as a patient advocate, because I do not identify as any one disease state, or, you know, work in ecosystems of evidence. And so you can have assumptions yourself sometimes when people look at things. But I want to say that the bigger issue is they don't understand that it's like they need to have a training on disclosure of interest. They don't understand that perhaps speaking and getting paid by industry or pharma to travel somewhere is actually a conflict of interest. And then how it's currently worded, I just want to say for the researchers who are on the panel, it states that, you know, that they won't gain, you know, sort of like notoriety or academic, but they do. Everybody that's on the panel, the clinicians and dentists, whoever that are on the panel, get recognition for being on that panel, right? So, and on the issue around compensation, some people say, well, none of the panelists get paid, but they get CMEs, you know, whatever medical. They also, their organization is covering for them to be there in most cases. I know I was on one panel where they weren't, and they did compensate them for the day as well when they found out they weren't covered by their medical organization to be there. But so that's very true. So, you know, not looking at public expertise or patient expertise, not receiving it is, you know, we could see that as a conflict of interest, that they receive this and we don't, right? So you have to think about that. And when you write a paper, you're going to get recognized for it. When you publish the, you know, this has always been a pet peeve, but the thing is having very clear delineation within your organization, what you're looking for, what is a disclosure of interest, because is it perceived and or obvious? And also I would suggest looking at people's social media accounts, because you'll see in Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, that's where they're going to talk about stuff.
Thank you, Janice, for all those points. Yeah, very, very, very good discussion. Sarah, is there anything else you wanted to add about this?
I'm just sort of thinking, sort of the way NICE kind of deals with this is, and you've probably touched on quite a lot of this already, but we call it's declaration of interest first and foremost. So we have an actual document, which is actually quite difficult to, we probably need to update some of it because it can be quite difficult to understand. But that tells people what a declaration of interest is before it becomes a conflict. So I think that kind of tackles some of the things that you're raising, Janet. And that's sent out at recruitment, so people will look at that, and then when they submit their application form, they will also submit a declaration of interest form. So that will hopefully capture all of their involvement, all of their research, and then at the beginning of the guideline development process, the first meeting, there will be a presentation which just summarises exactly what all the declarations of interest that need to be made, and gives examples of when things become conflict of interest and how it's managed. And then at every meeting, there's sort of a discussion up front where you have to disclose either before or during any new declarations of interests that crop up. So that's kind of how it's managed. I don't know if that's helpful knowing that.
Thank you, Sarah. Any other questions that people have on their mind, barriers, challenges they've encountered, or solutions and how to address them that they'd like to mention? I don't know if this is an issue people have encountered at all, but one question we were thinking about as a group was how to prevent recruiting the same interested pool of people and how to sort of widen it so that you are recruiting from a larger pool of people as well.
I can talk to this if it helps. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has encountered this. It's something that can crop up, particularly if people sort of struggle to recruit, but you do have a small pool of people. Sometimes people experience working with the same people. This crops up with different organisations within the UK. And this can kind of cause all kinds of issues in the long run. Everything from not getting the representation you need, but also potential possible ethical issues of burden if the same person is being requested to or invited on lots of different types of guidelines or development activities. So we kind of try to track that at NICE, particularly now that we've got the expert panel, because obviously people may be applying for multiple guidelines. We may have one sitting on 3 or 4 if there isn't a clash, so we have to then manage all of that sort of thing. So yeah, we're trying to track that, particularly at the recruitment stage, so that people can state whether or not they are involved in any other, or have been involved in any other NICE guidelines or anything else with other organisations, and we sort of take that into consideration. It can be a benefit, obviously, if people have got experience of other things, but it also can mean that it's the same people taking up the opportunities, which then may take away the opportunities from others. So I don't know if anybody else has had any other experiences of this, or whether it's an issue that you've thought about.
Thanks, Sarah. Just looking at the chat box as well here. Again, a question about recruiting patient representatives who are healthcare providers as well. This is still a great area to explore. I feel like there might be some discrepancies between organizations and how this is handled. I don't know on behalf of the GIN Public Toolkit if we really address this at all. Sarah, I know you spoke about this a little bit before too, and Hiba, so if you have anything further you want to add about this, please feel free to.
I think Sarah mentioned something very important. If the healthcare provider has a direct relation with the same topic, so our recommendation is not to include at least, so this is the minimum. So ideally, in my opinion, I wouldn't include healthcare provider, but for example, I wouldn't include a dentist as a patient in the guideline panel in dentistry, for example. So I may be a patient in any others, but not in my specialty. This is the minimum, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. We support that. I think there is, and I can't recall it, but I think there is some literature out there about the types of biases and issues that can crop up. One of the things here, we're talking about trying to avoid tokenistic public involvement. And I think when we have people who are highly educated in the area, which a health professional will be, then they may not be able to, even though they might be a patient themselves, experiencing the condition or whatever. The issue is that they're going to be able to, or they will see the literature and the evidence from a different perspective. They may miss, if you think about the tasks, some of the tasks of patient and public members may be to look at the language, maybe to address discrepancies, and those things could be missed by people who are also health professionals in that area. But at the same time, if people are struggling to recruit, I can see why it would sort of seem attractive to recruit someone like this. And that's why I think we say it nice to consider if someone is a health professional but not directly in that area, then that can be considered. But we have to still bear in mind that bias that we may be introducing. I don't know if that helps clear up the grey area.
Thanks, Sarah. Another question that we as a group were thinking about a little bit before as well relates to hearing from people who are seldom heard as well. And Sarah had presented on this a little bit before in the presentation about how we can overcome barriers to involving the people who are seldom heard. And she provides some examples for children and young people, people with learning disabilities, et cetera. And those examples were provided because that's where what the literature speaks to, from my understanding as well. I was wondering if other people have, experiences to share about overcoming barriers to involving other groups of people who might be seldom heard. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, maybe people who are experiencing homelessness, if the guideline topic is focused on that. Just if there's any experiences to share about how we can recruit and how we can best hear from people that we really need to be hearing from. I see yes, they're saying pediatric guidelines are another area. Children versus parents, families, cares, views, values, and preferences. Yeah. Sarah, I know you have some experience, I think, about this. I don't know if you want to jump in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I know this is something that NICE are looking into and really trying to establish methods and processes for ensuring we are recruiting people with all kinds of experience, all kinds of backgrounds is necessary. And I suppose one of the things that NICE does is we do an equalities impact assessment, which I think we talk about very briefly in this chapter. And that basically is currently being revised, but that basically encourages the developer to think about what are the potential inequalities and health inequalities that may be relevant to the topic of the guideline. And that needs to be thought about right at the beginning of the development, and including how are we going to address this throughout the guideline development process, and how are we going to ensure that we're going to be including the voices of the people that the guideline is relevant for. So we're coming up with all kinds of different strategies for this, and obviously recruitment is one of the areas. Although that in itself has challenges, we do have specific charities and organisations in the UK that address, for example, race inequalities, but at the same time, there's not that many of these organisations in the grand scheme of things, and that same issue of being burdened because they are being invited to comment on every single consultation, so they then have to manage that. So, and then we've also got different charities that may not feel like they've got enough knowledge or experience to contribute to a guideline. So that then, to overcome that, we're having to do engagement work and work with those organisations to potentially upskill them in how they could potentially contribute to NICE and throughout the consultations. There's a whole host of other things that we consider, including looking at evidence, if it exists, around different inequalities or groups of people relevant to the topic. And we may also obviously aim to look at doing either targeted consultations. So, for example, we've done the homelessness guideline, or we're in the process of doing it. And we worked with the charity to help us with targeted consultation for people who are experiencing homelessness, so that they could then comment on the draft guideline. So that was a really good way and wasn't too expensive. So that tackled that kind of thing. Those are just some suggestions. I don't know if anybody has anything else. I can see here we've got suggestions around using interpreters, which is, yeah, absolutely, and making transcripts of meetings when working with people who are hearing impaired, absolutely. And we also make sure the light's okay, which I'm trying to make sure it's okay, you can see my face. so people can lip read, things like that.
Thanks, Sarah. See some other great comments here as well in the chat box from Nicholas asking he'd be interested in learning how guideline developers solicit perspectives from patients with cognitive impairment or dementia. Great question as well. Janice, also, I see your hand up too, so feel free to jump in. I'm not sure if it's a response to that, but feel free to go ahead, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to now touch on what you were just mentioning about individuals experiencing homelessness. So language is really important rather than saying homeless individuals, but so having individuals with different lived experience, and that's why I have been on so many different things, because I have lived fairly well, and I don't have a college degree. I live, in poverty, now, and I have experienced homelessness. So all of those, I've, socially determined health I've experienced. So there isn't a lot of people in evidence that has experienced that. So, and I still, first started making resource guides like 15, 20 years ago for community members in the Muslim community, as well as the greater community who are experiencing homelessness. Actually, 1995 was the first time. So I have a very odd background. So sometimes you don't know, what I'm trying to say is you want to bring people on that have different lived experiences. And the issue I had with one guideline panel is, they're saying, well, no, we don't have compensation. And I said, you're only going to end up with white middle class women, mostly, or upper class. And that's true. They're highly educated and they do have experiences, but that is not representative. And if we're moving in the area of equity, which is we are, and so we have to be very thoughtful in bringing people on. I consider myself a placeholder, but I always work very hard to bring individuals from different backgrounds onto multiple different projects. And that needs to be, asking people things like that can help, because you will almost always get a response from white middle class people in the first round.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Janice, so much for that. It's so valuable. I think it's so important to be thinking about who we're not hearing from and why we're not hearing from them as well, and to really be thinking about how we can actively be changing that too. And thanks for pointing out as well about terminology and language too. I think that's so important, and we need to hear from people as well in order to make sure that we are using
like individuals
yeah
with diabetes, or individuals with experience of diabetes. We don't say diabetic, we still do that, but when we're talking with people, we have to be very conscientious. Persons who experience low back pain, persons who are experiencing or have experienced homelessness, put the individual first always.
Yeah, thank you, Janice. Just looking at the chat box here, and Sarah, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah,
there is a question from Yasser.
Is there any preference regarding when to involve patient representatives in guideline development or in the external peer review group, or are they the same? I can just speak from maybe my perspective briefly with RNAO would be, we would ideally love to have people who have lived experience involved as early on in the guideline development process. Sarah had talked about how important that is, even for helping shape the purpose and scope of the guideline too, all the way throughout to when the recommendations are being developed, and but then also definitely at the peer review stage too. For us, it's kind of a stakeholder review stage, and it would be really important to be hearing from people then too. Sarah or Hiba, do you want to jump in there as well?
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree with that. I think we share the same perspective there. In terms of external or peer review group, I'm trying to work out exactly what that means, whether and how that translates, because I suppose at NICE we have consultation, which is a form of peer review, I suppose.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah, okay, great. We've also got something else where we do have an external reference group, so it just depends on the setup. But if you mean consultation type thing, then yeah, I mean we do consultations first of all at the scope. So we have a workshop where we can involve patient organizations specifically. Sometimes we have, and we try to get patient representatives or members of the public there, particularly if they have been put forward by one of the organizations to attend. That's usually quite good at that. And then of course we involve them externally through consultation of a scope, and then again at when we consult on the draft guidelines. So I don't know if that answers your
Yeah,
question.
actually, the question was about the time. I mean, like in the very beginning or in the very end? Like in the beginning of the guideline project, or after, for example, the first draft of the guideline is done?
Yeah, so we do it in multiple points. So at the beginning and at the draft. So yeah, multiple points throughout the process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I recognize that we have probably about 5 minutes or so left too. One of the questions I did want to ask to the group as well, and those on the line, would be what you would want to see in a next edition of this chapter as well. So if you have suggestions on this, like what hasn't been covered that you think would be very helpful to be covered in the chapter, that would be great to hear from people. You can put that in the chat. You can email us directly about this as well. And we can spend a bit of time chatting about this here as well. We will hope to, I think the plan will be to update the chapter sometime in the future. And so it's always good to hear. There is a evaluation survey that's online as well for the toolkit. So you are welcome to provide feedback and fill that out too, and suggest what needs to be covered in the next edition. I would just want to say thank you as well to everyone. It is so valuable to hear other perspectives from different organizations, to hear about ways we can really work to continuously strengthen the way that we are involving patients and members of the public in guideline development. So Sarah, I will maybe pass it back to you. I know we have a slide with our emails as well on it, so maybe we can bring that up too. And I'll pass it back to you, Sarah. Thanks.
Absolutely. Let me just I think this is it. Can you see my so I just want to echo that, just say thank you everybody for coming and for contributing to this. I think it's fantastic to get everyone together and actually talk about people's experiences and how to overcome these barriers. So these are all the questions that we had. So yeah, as Lindsay just mentioned, obviously there's a link here. I don't know if we're going to circulate these slides. Hopefully we will. So you can provide information and feedback by taking the survey. We've also got our contact details here if you want to get in touch and find out about anything else. And then of course we've got this Padlet which we're trying to produce as a resource. We thought it'd be good to try and capture. We've also got the chat function that we may sort of consolidate into a resource which we can circulate just so that we've captured everybody's barriers and solutions. We'll keep this Padlet live. There's a QR code here or a link to go straight to it. We'll keep it live for a week after today, so you've got time if you want to contribute to that and fill it in. But other than that, I will say thank you, and thank you to also Lindsay and Heba for contributing to this and to the toolkits. It's been fantastic. So wish you all well, and maybe speak soon, who knows.
Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.